Despite the sense of finality FNAF 3 presented, we still obviously had some lingering questions. We know figures like Purple Guy were responsible for the murders, but we didn't actually know who he was personally, which is why he was simply known as Purple Guy for a very long time. You also had the closing newspaper screen after completing Night 6, first revealing that the horror attraction ended up burning down, but then when brightening up the image, we see that Springtrap is implied to have actually survived the fire, from how we can see him in the background. But let's just say that if FNAF 3 truly was the final game to be released in the series, I don't think you could complain too much. The key plot point of the 5 lost souls in the original animatronics was wrapped up nicely. Moving on from that, you're either going to have to elaborate on those details that are up in the air, or come up with entirely new plot threads to keep the story going. It's a very risky game to play. Once you start losing sight of where you originally started, you can easily start losing fans, because what brought them in to begin with has now become absent. And not to mention, if these new story threads aren't as compelling as the ones which came before it, the overall experience will suffer as a result. That's only the story side of things though. We have to bear in mind that while Cawthon managed to cleverly evolve the core gameplay with FNAF 3, there's realistically only so many times you can work off this formula before it becomes stale. And let's just say that when it comes to FNAF 4, Cawthon seems very aware of that fact, changing up the series gameplay in the most substantial manner we've seen as of yet, and ingeniously bringing the importance of audio back into the fold in the biggest way possible. The run-up to the game's release was fairly routine, getting several teasers on the Scott Games website showing off the release date, the new animatronics, and also labeling this game as the final chapter. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. The animatronics we were seeing in these images, however, were nothing short of terrifying, all of them seeming to be based off Freddy, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy, but giving them redesigns to make them appear about as scary as possible. We're stepping far away from the whole pared down, uncanny valley side of their previous designs, and instead are going for all-out horror. And as we can see in the initial teaser image, when you brighten it up, we see the phrase nightmare revealed, which is what all of these variants are now referred to as. Outside their designs, which we'll talk more about when getting into the game, we also had a question posed on several of these images. Was it me? Was it me? Or me? Of course, we have no real clue what this is referring to initially, but it most definitely was effective in getting the fanbase intrigued once again. From my personal memories at the time, I did feel a drop-off when it came to the release of FNAF 3. It felt like the momentum from the first two games was slowing down, but with the release of these horrifying and mysterious teasers, there was a good deal of anticipation going into this one. It seemed like what appeared as a rather tame horror venture with FNAF 3 was now getting put into overdrive. Opening the game up for the first time, on top of the usual jump scare warning we receive, we're also told that to play this game in the most effective way possible, we should put on a set of headphones. Evil stuff here from Cawthon, but it works and is also pretty hilarious. We'll talk about why headphones are so essential when getting into the gameplay, but needless to say, this isn't being understated. FNAF 4 puts a heavy emphasis on audio-based cues this time, and not like the loud footsteps and groans we've heard before, but instead extremely subtle and stereo-based cues that'll force you to crank your volume up, and even if you're using speakers, be very aware of what's coming through the individual audio channels. Reaching the main menu, FNAF 4 presents a striking image that stamps this wonderfully twisted sense of style right from the get-go. The only colours we see are these crimson red and black tones, and on the outer peripheries, we get a glimpse at 3 of the animatronics we'll be tussling with. In the centre of the image, things appear more blurred, but we can still clearly make out several trees in the distance, and what seems to be a lone house in the middle of nowhere. Everything about this main menu screen is excellent to me. The image in itself is already spine-tingling. It seems the idea of this game being an outright nightmare is gone about in a surprisingly direct manner, because from how we see these animatronics peering out of the bushes, all looking towards the house in the distance, we already pretty much know it's going to be us that's in that house, and there's nothing whatsoever about these guys that appears to be all that friendly. The word foreboding comes to mind whenever I return to the main menu, as especially when you pair it up with the music that plays in the back, which I should say is equally brilliant as everything else. The spine-tingling sensation it makes me feel fills me with both excitement and total fear. This feeling continues when starting a new game, being told that it's 5 days until the party, as well as speaking with what seems to be a version of Golden Freddy with a purple hat and bow tie. He tells us that someone's locked us in our room again, and that he's here to keep us company. Coming out of the darkness, we're shown to be in a bedroom, with us taking control of another crying child. The Golden Freddy that sits on our bed can be seen to have small white eyes that follow us around the room. Much like the other animatronics in the corner, he seems to simply be a stuffed toy, but of course, with the way he's able to look at us and talk to us, there's clearly something more going on with him. Not to mention, the separation between him on the bed and the other animatronics gives him a sense of importance. There's something about this toy in particular that this child seems to connect with. During this, we hear yet another ominous audio track in the back, being mainly ambient for the most part, but getting frequent variations of laughter interspersed in between. And although we don't have any real grip on our situation as of right now, we can already make an assumption that these laughs could be related towards whoever locked us in our room. And with it being a child we're controlling, that would also mean it's more than likely one of our family members that's done this. The section ends when our attempts to get out and bashing on our door result in failure, having the child curl up into a ball and continue crying, being told by the toy that tomorrow is another day. It's unclear currently if this message is one of support or purely observation, because on one hand, you could say this is a form of encouragement towards the child, recognizing the position they're currently in and telling them that when tomorrow comes, they can start fresh. But equally, it could be an acknowledgement that tomorrow's another day, and it's going to be another day of the same torment we're witnessing. After that short opening sequence, we're taken right into the first night, and out of all the games we've experienced, I'd say FNAF 4 easily has the most direct and abrasive introduction so far. This might not initially seem to be the case, because as you're able to see, the first thing that stands out when initially observing our environment are the massive tip boxes that show up on screen telling us how to play. And while I think they are a bit distracting to show someone on their very first time playing, I also completely understand why they're here, because at the end of the day, you can immediately tell this is nothing like what we've seen before. There's no office, there's no posters, and as we saw from the main menu screen, we don't appear to be in a restaurant, but instead are in a house, and more specifically, what looks to be a child's room. We can see this from many of the toys that are scattered on the floor, even having the return of our office fan in toy form on top of the drawers. Outside the tips, however, which most players will find themselves switching off pretty quickly after getting to grips with everything, my favourite part of how we start this game is the complete lack of hand-holding. Just witness for yourself how the very first night starts and you'll see what I mean. Notice anything? Aside from the phenomenal ambience that we'll get into later, you should have realised that our usual phone message from either phone guy or phone dude is gone. In the first game, these phone calls were somewhat essential towards laying out how the animatronics functioned and how we should go about combating them. In FNAF 2 and 3, you still had bits of information that related to the gameplay and the individual mechanics we were utilising, but you would have seen that especially in the case of FNAF 3, most of the messages we start getting were far more related to the story. In FNAF 4, we get nothing, and it makes you realise that aside from giving us advice, there was always somewhat of a comfort drawn from the fact that we were hearing another human voice. As for the rest of our time in these establishments, we're left completely on our own, and are dealing with animatronics that are trying to kill us at all times. We don't get that luxury here, we're on our own from night 1 onwards, and knowing what each of the animatronics look like, it makes the experience even more frightening to begin with. Now, there's many things to point out here considering how substantial of a change has been made to numerous aspects, but taking them one at a time, the first thing which grabs my attention is the look of our surroundings, and how our room and the corridors to the side are laid out. As I established, what seems to be in front of us is a children's room, the toys on the floor, the stars stuck to the walls, the kids' clothes we can see hanging out the drawers and in the closet. With what we saw in the opening sequence, it's telling us straight away that the character we're inhabiting is more than likely the crying child. Nothing in the room itself particularly stands out, and I guess that's kind of the point. It does just look like a young child's bedroom, with the only thing I'm really drawn to being the purple colours we see on the fan and robot. That's obviously because of the growing significance of Purple Guy, but even then, I don't think these toys or their colour play any role in the story. One thing that you'll start noticing though is the fear that I feel has been reintroduced from FNAF 1 and 2 when it comes to our doorways and closet. The effects felt the strongest in the first game due to the nature in which everything else plays out around it, but even when it comes to FNAF 2, having that massive pitch black hole in the centre of your office was damn unnerving. You had no concept of what was hiding in the darkness before illuminating it with your light, and even then, what you oftentimes end up seeing will result in you feeling even more on edge. FNAF 4 not only retains that, but pushes it to the next level in my opinion. Shining our light onto each of these sections, you'll notice that despite having the closet and doors themselves lit up, anything beyond that is still pitch black, meaning we still have no concept of what's potentially in our doorways or hiding in our closet. This equally applies to when we turn behind us and look at our bed. Before we turn our flashlight on, we can hardly see anything at all, now managing to create a significant degree of anticipation and fear when it comes to lighting things up. In pretty much every instance in the series, turning on lights is typically always seen as a good thing. Even in the first game where you were given a fright when lighting up the animatronics in our hallway, it was still a relief knowing that you'd spotted them and could now close the door without feeling like you're wasting power. We'll get into this side of things more when looking at the gameplay, but even when just looking at the game, you should be able to see that the feeling of safety has disappeared. There's no immediate and surefire protection like the doors from the first game. The illumination of our environment is now constantly on the brink of giving the player relief or making them jump out of their skin. Talking of the bed behind us, however, there's once again not much of note, aside from the Freddy toy that sits on it, which we can boop on the nose. We only really see some additional photos hanging above the bed, and yet another lamp, which for some reason this kid doesn't want to use. When looking to each of our doorways, however, you should immediately start realizing how weird the layout of this house actually is. Lighting up both hallways, there's once again nothing which appears to be out of the ordinary. We see some paintings and windows on the right hand side, and on the left we see some pictures on the wall and a grandfather clock at the end. But in describing this, you might have already seen where the problem lies. I have never in my life seen a bedroom that's not only got two entrances on opposite sides of the room, but also is directly connected to two main hallways in the house. We can't see fully behind our door, so it's unclear if the hallway ends right at our room or continues on past it, but the layout is downright bizarre. We can see how it's working as almost an exact mirror of what we saw in FNAF 1, but to apply it in the context of a seemingly normal house is really strange when you start thinking into it. However, this isn't a mistake. There is a good reason as to why this is done when it comes to the gameplay and narrative. The unconventional design ends up being a key part in realizing what it is we're actually experiencing, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Completing night 1, we're brought back to the 8-bit styled gameplay segment, with this being the case for the completion of every night in the game. 4 days now remain until the party, with who this party's for, where it's happening, and why it's happening still being unknown. The crying child's able to leave his room this time, in which the golden teddy follows us around each of the rooms we enter. The movement in itself, and the positions he finds himself in, reinforcing this doll to either be some kind of spirit, or perhaps a figment of this kid's imagination. Before leaving the room, we were told that someone's hiding again, and when eventually entering the living room to the left hand side, we get scared by a person wearing a foxy mask, being reminded once again that tomorrow is another day. We'll learn who this person is in the upcoming nights, but one interesting detail to know is that when entering the room to our right before the living room, we discover another bedroom. On the floor is what seems to be mangle, or at least several parts of mangle that are scattered around. People have speculated why and how mangle appears in this way, because as we discover later on, it shouldn't make sense for it to be here considering when the events of this game take place. I tend to agree with the notion that much like several elements in the FNAF games, not everything should be taken to such a literal extent. I understand that people want to find meanings to all this stuff, and admittedly, the series itself does very much encourage that kind of mentality. However, I can't help but see something like this as a mere reference and nothing more. The first thing it makes me think of is the mangle minigame we saw in FNAF 3, with how we started off simply as a head and had to go collect the rest of our parts throughout the level. It's an important thing to put out there, because for as much as I really enjoy the story and think there's a ton of thought that's gone into it, I don't think Cawthon is Stanley Kubrick. There's many things in these games which I can clearly see are inserted for either reference purposes or as fun little Easter eggs, and I believe the appearance of Mangle here fits into that category. After this, you would have thought we'd get brought straight into night 2, but much like every night in the game, we're first given the chance to play an extra game called Fun with Plushtrap. As we're told, our objective is to use our flashlight to stop Plushtrap on the X in front of us, with the reward being a pretty substantial 2-hour head start going into the next night. The only caveat is that you've only got one attempt at this. Failing it or closing the game at this point will take the opportunity away, and you'll be starting the next night at 12 AM without the option to retry. Fun with Plushtrap is simple, but puts the importance of audio to the forefront, just like the main bulk of the game does. As you can see when turning on our light, despite aspects like the wallpaper, flooring and doorways giving us the initial impression that we're in a fairly typical house, the environment appears weird when you start breaking it down again. There's 4 doorways right beside each other, and a corridor that leads to a dead end. It's another area I find really bizarre, but it's still a quality that I equally admire. We've talked about the uncanny valley several times at this point, and these environments so far seem like the pinnacle of that phenomenon. Not unusual enough to be described as abstract, but strange enough to notice there's something not quite right. Even small details like the window above that shows the night sky and the leaves from the trees outside. It doesn't just look great, but it makes the scene feel even more fleshed out. We saw the trees which surround the house on the main menu, staying consistent with what we've been shown previously, and as has been the case with all the FNAF games realistically, despite all appearing a lot more pared down when compared to some of Cawthon's more ambitious looking projects in the past, that same level of detail when it comes to the scenery has never dissipated, as is the case for the entirety of FNAF 4, despite still only being made by one guy. Cawthon's reached a point where I couldn't describe anything here as amateurish. All of these games feel like they've been put together by someone with a good deal of experience in video game development, and as we know, that very much applies to Cawthon by this point. When it comes to how the minigame plays out, it's exactly what it says on the tin. Every time, Plushtrap starts at the other end of the corridor, and will only move when your light's turned off. On top of this, we're actually given a set time limit in which we can complete this, starting off at 90 seconds during this first attempt, and going all the way down to 30 seconds on the final one. Less time means less chances to check on where Plushtrap is, meaning that with each night, you're having to take more and more of a risk by leaving your flashlight off for longer periods of time. In that final 30-second version, for example, you're essentially having to keep the flashlight off for the whole time until he reaches the X in front. And as I said to begin with, sound's the main way to identify when Plushtrap's moved, creating a slow muffled sound when taking steps forward, and a fast-paced sprinting sound when entering either of the two hallways. Although it's always made possible to complete in under 30 seconds because of that night, I'm pretty sure his behaviour does vary somewhat with each new attempt. As from my experience, even without disrupting his route towards the X with the flashlight, his movement patterns and the speed in which he executes these movements do feel like they vary. Either way, this is a damn tense experience every time we're brought back to it. It's once again a nightmarish situation we're getting placed in, having the tantalising reward of starting at 2 AM in the next night, with the fear of getting jump scared if we take too many risks and don't pick up on sound cues. And that is entirely possible. If you run out of time, you don't get jump scared. But when it comes to the sounds that are generated, while the movement to the left and right doorways are quite clear whenever they play, the muffled footsteps forward can easily find themselves blending into the background ambience. At the end of the day, fun with Plushtrap is a part of the game that, just like everything else, can be mastered, and due to its simplistic nature, I have to imagine most players will be able to get to grips with it in a very short amount of time. After the first 2 nights, you'll realise that his movements are set in stone. He goes a step forward, moves to the right or left, takes another step forward, moves to the right or left again, and then a final step forward, which will always show him ending up on the X. It can't be understated though, if you don't have your volume cranked up, there is a massive chance that you're going to miss out on several of these audio cues, which isn't just a good lesson to instill for these mini-games, but also the main nights as well. Fun with Plushtrap is a great concept overall. Because of the risk you're always somewhat taking, even if you are aware of his movement patterns, there's always a degree of tension that's created no matter what. You've always got the knowledge that if you don't hear one of these audio cues quite right, most vitally the final one, you're getting jump scared. And coming off the back of FNAF 3, it's good to have a jump scare that feels like a total shock, one that you have no real chance to prepare for. And that applies even more so to the animatronics we're dealing with most of the time. Night 2 begins just like the previous night, and this is the case for every other night from here on out. No phone call, no relief whatsoever. We're plonked straight into the night, and have nothing else to focus our attention on except pure survival. Looking to the gameplay side of things, FNAF 4's interesting, and that while I think it is ultimately a more simplistic gameplay experience than we perhaps ever witnessed in the series up till now, it's also one that feels a lot more raw and visceral in how it's carried out. The bare bones nature of it works to its advantage. As you would have seen from how I went about navigating the first night, there's no real sense of strategy here, unlike what we saw in FNAF 3. The series has once again reinvented itself in a major way, the most notable switch up easily being the removal of the camera system. While I think FNAF 3 took the camera system to another level with a heavy emphasis on strategy in that game, we can't forget that even in the previous 2 games, the camera's still an inherently strategic tool. As I established, the longer you played these games, the more useless it eventually becomes. What starts off as a great way of conveying the environment you're located in and tracking the animatronics around the establishment soon becomes one where you're only really watching one camera for the entire night. FNAF 3 improved in that department, but equally, it felt like it reached a point where everything that could have possibly been garnered from the camera system has now been achieved. There's always new features and mechanics you could introduce to keep it fresh, of course, but it did perhaps feel like it was time for something new, and that's exactly what we get in FNAF 4. The camera's completely gone, meaning the only environments we're witnessing now are ones that can be seen with our own eyes. The biggest difference that now works as the camera's replacement is that we can now move between several points in our room as the main way of keeping an eye on the animatronics. And with that, while FNAF 3 presented gameplay that required proactive involvement on your behalf, FNAF 4 goes the complete opposite direction and turns almost the entire gameplay experience into one where you're constantly reacting to what's going on around you. Now make no mistake, I would define the removal of the camera system as a regression, but it's one that actually works in this case. Not only does the reinvention of the usual gameplay system feel refreshing coming off the back of the first few games, but the manner in which it's carried out does work effectively as well. In regards to our movement, movement, there's 3 points we can head to, and those are the right and left doorways, as well as the wardrobe in front. You also have the bed, of course, that we can more swiftly turn around to, and this ends up presenting one of 2 vital elements towards the gameplay that prevents it from potentially becoming boring or laborious, but we'll get more onto that when discussing the individual animatronics. Despite this movement system, however, don't be fooled into thinking this is a 3D environment. As you can see from the animation that plays when moving around, you see the screen first cuts to black, then you get a short animation of the floor as you move forward, and then are brought straight to the doorway. To its credit though, it does all still blend together really nicely to where nothing feels out of place or awkward. Although these are still 2D images we're looking at, it does genuinely feel like we're moving around our room instead of merely getting different PNGs thrown up on screen. And that's basically everything you've got to work with. From there, it's up to you to identify the incoming threats and act accordingly. And the way in which we deal with them all revolves around either shining our light, which is done by pressing Control, or closing the doors or wardrobe, which is done by pressing Shift. For me, I think we've got another fantastic gameplay system that, while remaining simplistic, works perfectly when put in context with the overall experience. What were some of my biggest complaints in the previous games? I didn't think these games were scary when the gameplay became too overwhelming. FNAF 4 lies in kind of a perfect in-between for me in that regard. As the nights progress, you'll find yourself dashing back and forth between each door, which might seem rather intense, but you also have to understand that because of how audio plays such a significant role in this game, which as I said, we'll get onto in a second, the amazing atmosphere that once again returns in this game is enhanced even further. Because of how you spend so much time paying attention to the sound of the game, it's quite literally unavoidable. You're made to bathe in it regardless. Whether it creeps you out or not is a different issue, and it always has been. But looking purely from the point of view of having the gameplay be too overwhelming, I tend to find that even when we get to the hardest nights in the game, these qualities never dissipate and are never diminished, whereas I felt the increasing difficulty and barrage of animatronics in some of the previous games did take away from it somewhat. FNAF 4 doesn't seem to have a problem with that whatsoever. Now, you've also got a potential issue on the flip side of that. If the game's so based around listening to sound, isn't the gameplay going to be a bit more dull without the cameras? And I can't deny, for some players, I think that will be the case. I'm not exaggerating when I say the gameplay here is significantly pared down compared to what we've been used to in the series. Although there is still depth here, it's kind of like if you take the door and light mechanic from FNAF 1 and have that be the whole game, a process of waiting for something to come to your door and closing it. There is obviously more to FNAF 4 than just that, but that's the core concept realistically. As I said, this game is based on pure reaction, a call and response in many ways. You hear something's up, you go and react. What keeps the experience just as engaging, however, directly ties into the lack of that camera system, because now we're completely in the dark. We have no way of getting a visual on these animatronics before they're already in a position to screw us over, which takes the game's emphasis on sound to the next level. Just like we found ourselves doing in the Fun with Plushtrap minigame, the audio cues become incredibly important towards navigating through each night safely. Some would argue this turns it into the most engaging experience in the series, and I can understand that point of view to an equal amount, because when you do find yourself reaching some of the later nights, you haven't just got your mind focused on carefully listening to the audio, but as I said, you'll find yourself at points dashing back and forth around your room as you find yourself just barely surviving. With all that being said though, because of how there's no exterior music boxes or system resets we need to keep an eye on now, it's the animatronics we're dealing with that are ultimately the be and end all towards making the game work. And much like everything else we've seen so far, I'd have to say they're implemented in a superbly terrifying way. Arriving back at the 8-bit sequence, there's 3 days left until the party, but unlike the previous nights which found us in our house, it seems we've ended up in one of the pizzerias, as can be seen by the general look of the place, with the balloons and colourful glitter, but also obviously the giant picture of what seems to be the golden version of Freddy up on the wall. We're told that we've been left alone, assumedly by the same person who scared us with the Foxy mask, and that he knows we hate it here, revealing why the day-by-day reminder is so important each time we come back. The crying child apparently hates this place, and is more than likely scared of the animatronics, yet it seems that his birthday's coming up and he's going to be having his party staged in this restaurant. Just as we get up to exit this place, however, we're blocked off by someone dressed up in one of the suits, which is really the smoking gun as to where this takes place. When this is happening is still yet to be seen, but as we know from what we were told in the previous games, the only restaurant we've heard about that featured these springlock suits was Fredbear's Family Diner, which means our golden toy, as well as the guy dressed up in the suit, is known as Fredbear. There's an additional detail we can also witness though when leaving the screen and coming back to it, having the door at the back open up for a second, and revealing Purple Guy placing the head of a spring Bonnie suit onto someone else's head. The only real meaning I can distinguish from this is a reinforcement of the Purple Guy's presence throughout all the restaurants we've witnessed so far. From what we've seen, there's no evidence that he'd killed anyone by this point, so it seems to mainly be alluding to the fact that no matter what variant of the restaurant's been set up throughout the years, Purple Guy always seems to be working there. Because let's not forget, in FNAF 2, he worked during both the day and night shifts, and in FNAF 1, he was once again said to have been an employee. Outside that minor secret though, the crying child once again collapses in fear, and is told tomorrow is another day. Enough playing around though, but I think it's about time we took a deep dive into the animatronics here, because although I've already established how much I like their new designs, the way in which they function, while still being relatively simple, is most definitely effective when it comes to scaring the living daylights out of you. First off, let's take a second to truly appreciate the designs of all these guys, as I would describe them as pretty magnificent. The main four animatronics that come after us each night are Nightmare Freddy, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy, so once again from that lineup, you can see a lot of inspirations being drawn from the first game in the series compared to any of the others. Nightmare Freddy isn't actually seen that much in game, as despite being in the same room as us at all times, he's in fact hiding under our bed, where he instead sends his Freddles out to come torment us. But just like all of the nightmares, there's parts of their designs that remain consistent with many of the animatronics we've seen before. The torn up suits, the exposed wiring, the large glaring eyes. Even when looking to all those aspects in these nightmare designs, everything's been amplified in just about every way you can imagine. Their mouths are filled with 2 rows of these sharp metal spikes that appear far more devastating compared to the usual plastic ones we see before. The glare from their eyes feels even more piercing with how they're now lit up, with all of them having colours that correlate to each individual animatronic. The internal endoskeletons now feature these razor-sharp claws, and in Foxy's case, razor-sharp feet as well. Their state of decay and disrepair is still ultimately their defining quality, and we have seen that before when it comes to animatronics like the Withers and Springtrap. But again, it's the sheer extremes these elements are taken to that not only sets them apart from all the other animatronics, but turns them into the most frightening designs I think the series has to offer. It's a different kind of fear from what we're used to, and we've gradually been getting used to it with each new release. It's no longer about supposedly friendly and welcoming animatronics turning evil. These guys look menacing and dangerous right from the off. These are what you would expect the enemy to look like in a horror video game, but I still find their designs so intricately, and still have such a degree of individual personality, that I don't have an issue whatsoever. In fact, what we've got here is kind of the reverse of the first game. Yeah, the animatronics looked ominous in the first game, but that's just how they looked in general. The suits didn't change when the kids came in during the day. If you remember, it was the environments that oftentimes presented some of the more outright creepy images. The endoskeleton in the backstage, the crying child on the walls. In FNAF 4, our surroundings appear relatively normal for the most part, so to now have that contrasted with these more unrealistic and extreme designs brings a whole new kind of fear to the table. It's a kind of fear that can hit closer to home in some ways, as due to this kind of house environment being one that most will relate to, it can leave you with a fear after you've turned the game off, hoping that something similar doesn't come invading your home either. So the designs of these initial 4 are excellent, and that goes for every single one of them. Whether it be Chica's Nightmare Cupcake or Freddy's Freddles, all of these characters stand out from each other, while still working with the same general design principles. Their style's distinct because of the emphasis on extremes, and when pairing all of these up with the pitch black environments they're creeping around in, these are what I'd honestly describe as the perfect set of characters when it comes to what FNAF 4 is attempting to pursue. Now in regards to their individual functions, this is where I think it starts getting revealed that there is still a good deal of depth when it comes to the gameplay, because as per usual, Cawthon's once again modelled the gameplay loop we indulge in around the idea of call and response. For every action we take, there's a potentially lethal response when it comes to the animatronics, and when it comes to our sole prevention method of closing our doors, this is something that, as you could have already assumed, we can't rely on for a substantial period of time, as simply staying at one door for too long leaves us open to other attacks coming from elsewhere in the room. To break it down rather simply, Bonnie approaches from the left and Chica approaches from the right, just like the first game, and the manner in which you deal with them is as simple as it is deceiving at times. As I mentioned, the audio is everything here. It keeps you aware of which door you should be heading to and prevents you from wasting time looking somewhere else, which obviously could give another animatronic the opportunity to jump scare you. Their movements can be laid out the clearest when turning on a cheat that reveals the overall map, and as you can see, compared to all the other games, we're working with a very small grid in FNAF 4. So at the beginning of every night, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy all start at the opposite end of the map, which isn't that far away this time. As they start wandering around, however, every single movement they make can be heard, all of which correlate to what side they're coming in from, and depending on the volume of these footsteps, it also indicates how close they are towards your room. Bonnie and Chica's footsteps sound exactly the same, giving out this fairly muffled trudging sound. However, with Foxy, we hear the same audio effect that played when he ran during the first game, which makes it stand out a lot more. These are vital to pay attention to if you want to survive the night, but even without the map obviously, this can all be tackled by standing directly in the center of your room and just listening to the sounds around us. And that's where the gameplay loop comes in for me, when what kept everything engaging. Even if you figured out what the footsteps sound like, what they signify, and how close they are to your door. Because of how we're lacking the option of physically looking at their position through a camera, there's always going to be some lingering doubt as to if you've got it right or not, much like fun with Plushtrap. So no matter if I'm judging the footsteps I hear as closer or further away, once I hear that sound, I go and investigate immediately. The one exception is when Chica finds herself in the kitchen, in which we can hear her moving around plates and glasses. This is the only time we're informed we don't need to check our right doorway currently, as whenever Chica's in the kitchen, we're at no risk of her instantaneously coming to our door or walking down our hallway. With that being said, if one of these guys does end up coming right to our door, then it simply becomes a matter of you detecting whether or not they're actually there. Whenever we check our door, we're still in pitch black darkness, so the only identifier that's given is the sound of the animatronics breathing. A bizarre quality these Nightmare Animatronics hold, but also surprisingly difficult to hear at points. It's not because the sound itself is too quiet, it's more the way in which it's delivered which can catch you out. Patience is most definitely required when listening out for the breathing, because at times, the breathing can become quite sporadic, leaving you hanging for a few seconds before being able to actually be heard. And once you hear the breathing, you close the door and wait until they've walked away, as flashing your light at this point leads to a nasty surprise. Overall, how we deal with Bonnie and Chica is fine, but it's nothing that blows me away either. At the end of the day, footsteps have always played a substantial role in identifying the movement of these animatronics. The main difference with FNAF 4 ultimately comes down to the map. Because of how important the sound of the footsteps are, paired up with how small the map is, if you don't cotton on to the fact that one of these guys is walking down one of your hallways, they're gonna end up standing at one of your doors or entering your bedroom directly if you take too long. In regards to these two animatronics, you're working purely off instinct. You hear the sound, you go and react. And I'd say all the audio does a good job in still providing a fair gameplay experience despite the lack of cameras. Even if some players don't pick up on the subtle volume increases that signify how close these guys are to your door, most will clearly understand that when you hear something in your right audio channel, Chica's in the right hallway, and when you hear something on the left, Bonnie's in that hallway. The only real degree of strategy realistically is in relation to our flashlight. The purpose of using it in our hallways isn't just so we can see nothing's there. Instead, if we look back to the map, you'll see that each hallway is given 3 boxes that get closer to our room. For both Bonnie and Chica, once they move to their individual hallways, the sound of footsteps plays. In this case, the sound's incredibly faint and easily missable, and equally, when you go to either of your doors and flash your light, you won't see anything. When they move on to this second square, the footsteps become a lot more noticeable, and it's here where shining your flashlight can benefit you quite a bit, as compared to when they're right next to your door, which just results in you dying. The flashlight will briefly show them at the end of the hallway before they back away, resetting their position to the central square at the top of the screen. Sounds simple, but still works really well. One thing you notice about these animatronics when looking at their movements on the map is that misdirection plays a key role in throwing you off, and making you lose track of where they are. Their movements aren't particularly conventional, even though they've only got a short amount of space to work with, you can oftentimes find them wandering back and forth between the squares at the top. So for example, say you're still unfamiliar with the rising volume levels and hear Bonnie enter your left hallway. If he then goes back to the center before entering the hallway once again, you could be tricked into thinking he's made his way forward, where you can shine your light and push him back. The consequence in this case isn't getting jump scared, it's about wasting your time to go and check on him when Chica and Foxy could be pushing closer down your right hallway. And talking of Foxy, once he starts getting properly active during the nights, he'll likely be the main animatronic you'll be focusing on. Although it might initially seem like a negative due to us having to deal with more threats, he can actually work as a focal point in judging what actions you take and what doors you head towards. Now, that doesn't mean you can simply ignore the other animatronics' footsteps if you hear them coming up to your door, but due to Foxy's being so much more noticeable and also occurring far more often with how he swiftly moves between our right and left hallways, an element of timing is introduced somewhat. As I said, unlike the other two, Foxy can make his way down either of your hallways, and along with that, he's also able to move in conjunction with either of the animatronics. But unlike them, he'll only go as far as the second square, and will never approach your door directly. This is because that if given the opportunity, which in this case would be you moving to the opposite doorway to the hallway that he's in, Foxy will run right into our room and enter the wardrobe in front. So now you can see how this relatively simple concept is starting to introduce a bit more depth. You need to keep an eye on Foxy, who's running all over the place, keep an eye on Bonnie and Chica, who build up to our doorway oftentimes in a more slow and subtle manner, and understand clearly when it is and isn't okay to use your flashlight, because in the event that you don't check on him when he's on that second square, any other movement will result in him entering your wardrobe. You might be thinking though, what does him entering your room actually mean? Well, that's where Freddy comes into play realistically, as he essentially provides the exact same function as Foxy, but merely from a different position. Both of these aren't too far off animatronics like Foxy from the first game or the marionette from the second. It's more a case of constantly checking on them before they get the chance to pounce, compared to the ones approaching from our doors that we have to actively react to. Foxy will enter several different states while in the wardrobe, one where his face is right in front, one where he's crouched down, another when he's standing up, and then bizarrely, a complete transformation into a small doll version, which is actually a massive hint as to the true nature of what these animatronics are and how they've come to be. The way you revert him to this state is by simply holding the door shut for a period of time, which obviously has the side effect of letting Bonnie and Chica simultaneously approach your doors. And as you could guess, if they're standing right outside and you take too long to check on them, you're gonna get jump scared. The Freddles which show up on the bed are essentially exactly the same as Foxy, except with these, you need to shine your light on them to make them go away. And additionally, these guys even give you a subtle audio notification that signifies to the player that it's time to check on them. The sound itself is almost nondescript. It's the same one they give out when looking at them on the bed, and while definitely having a metallic quality, it sounds somewhere in between screaming and laughter at the same time. So with that, you now understand that we've got two animatronics that behave in the exact same way, and require you to constantly check up on them, while also having to deal with the two coming from the hallways. Especially with the introduction of Foxy to your night, you're going to find more and more of your time getting taken up. Bear in mind that even when it comes to our doorways, we still have to listen out for the footsteps, wait to see if there's any breathing, hold the door shut until they walk away. So while it might initially seem like having Foxy in our room isn't too bad, the side effects will start becoming noticeable immediately. All in all, I find the gameplay here to be another alternate take on the FNAF formula that ends up working really effectively. It all comes down to the way in which sound is utilised, the footsteps coming in from the two separate audio channels, the warning from the Freddles behind. While these are informative, Cortham purposely and frequently obscures them with things like the background ambience, and also by simply turning down their volume levels and raising them over time. Naturally, to achieve greater success, that means you're having to whack your volume up to get a more clear idea on what you're actually hearing, which as a result makes any potential slip-ups all the more terrifying when they do inevitably occur. But even outside the audio side of things, the removal of the camera system ends up feeling warranted for me. You can see with the sequels to many games, the elements start getting stripped out or changed, basically for the sake of it, to make the series appear fresh and like it's evolving, when it's really not. And while I wouldn't say this is a true evolution for the FNAF series, because as I said, when you break everything down, it's actually quite similar to the first game, the focus on moving around our room and having our life hang in the balance with simply audio cues, it results in a gameplay experience that can feel frantic, stressful, and undeniably overwhelming at points. But while I had somewhat of an issue with that approach in the previous games, I find the general fear and scares in this game present something significantly more visceral compared to anything we've seen before. The scare itself will likely create more of an impact already because of the increase in your volume, but but it's also the suddenness that's arguably the most important factor. It's not a situation like the first game where you can know you're about to die, but won't have the jump scare activated before you flip up your camera. Here, you're informed instantly that you've messed up, and as we're about to see, the way in which you're informed is fairly unforgiving. With there being only 2 days left until the party, we once again are taken back to the crying child, who for some reason still finds themselves in the restaurant. However, unlike before, when we try to leave this time, we're no longer blocked off by the guy wearing the suit, and are able to walk around outside freely. It's time to make our way back home, where along the way, we not only see the toy Fredbear following us while hiding behind cars and in sewage drains, but we can also interact with some other kids that are scattered on several screens. The girl we meet outside the restaurant, for example, talks about the toy she's holding, but from there, our interactions turn a bit more strange and sour. First would be the girl with green eyes that we meet on the next screen, warning us that the animatronics come to life during the night and will try to kill you and hide your body so nobody finds it. And while she laughs it off, this is just about the worst thing you could possibly say to the crying child, considering how frightened he clearly is of the animatronics already. Then we come across a guy who's laughing on the floor, who turns out to be laughing at us, and how much of a baby the crying child is for being scared of the animatronics. And heading even further forward, we find a kid who hilariously looks identical to Balloon Boy, who confirms to us that the party which is taking place is our birthday party. From there we head back home, where upon wandering into our bedroom, we're once again scared by one of our family members, making it a bit more obvious now that the crying child's inherent fear of these animatronics may not have stemmed purely from the animatronics themselves, but perhaps more from the abuse that he's suffering in his home. One little secret we can find in this particular sequence, however, relates to the TV in the living room. Going up to it and pressing enter, we're shown what appears to be a TV show revolved around Fredbear, as well as being shown other characters like Bonnie and Chica alongside him. The most important detail that we're shown, however, is the confirmation that all the events we've been seeing are taking place in 1983. Looking purely at the context of the in-game universe, the only thing we've realistically been told and shown is in regards to the 2 spring animatronics during this time period. Only now, when it comes to the toys in our room, the TV show, and also a girl we can meet when making our way home who's playing with Freddy, Bonnie and Chica, that we're shown otherwise. This could purely stem from a lack of explicitly being told, however, something the series has done many times already. While we were only told about the Springlock suits during FNAF 3, you could rightly say there's nothing indicating that the other characters didn't also exist during this time either. Bear in mind, we're only seeing figures like Bonnie, Chica and Foxy in toy form. It could be a situation where despite all these characters existing, they haven't yet been made into animatronics and actually put into restaurants. So we've talked a lot about the audio in the game so far, but we've talked about it more in the context of how it affects the gameplay side of things compared to how they unnerve the player themselves. But make no mistake, those 2 elements are almost one and the same in this case. Much like the previous games, the sound of footsteps can be incredibly unsettling, simply from the point of view that the animatronics are getting closer and closer. But then you've also got things like the breathing in our doorways, which for me is similar in function to the sound we heard during the first game when catching the animatronics in our doorway. It's more the fact that the breathing sounds so animalistic and grisly, which catches me off guard whenever I hear it. The idea alone that we can hear these guys breathing is terrifying, as it always makes us feel right up close with them whenever they're at our doorway. Whereas in previous games, the animatronics have always appeared from further away until they jump scare us. And not to mention that they're actually breathing in the first place. We've heard these guys let out screams, play music, and even say hello in Balloon Boy's case. But having them breathe takes the Nightmare Animatronics to a whole new level of creepy. These guys feel more alive than ever, and pairing that up with how they look, it's a recipe for some real terror. The element which you've heard can serve as a make or break for me in many ways is the general ambience, and FNAF 4 definitely doesn't disappoint. The central ambient track is excellent, and I'd probably say it's my favourite in the series, superseding FNAF 1's. Listening to the track, it might initially sound like merely another drone track, and you would ultimately be right in saying that, but we're obviously not looking at it purely from the perspective of what it does individually. It's all about how it enhances and fits in with the overall experience, and that's where it really shines for me. Much like when it comes to the animatronics, I get a real visceral energy coming off this one for the majority of it. The drone we hear doesn't have the same level of variation in how it's been constructed. What we hear is one incredibly deep drone that has peaks and troughs when it comes to its rising and decreasing pitch, as well as the intensity of the sound. It's something else which throws me off balance every time I return to the game. While you look at the animatronics here and would think it fits in nicely, there's also something particularly ominous when it comes to hearing this when looking at our normal looking environment, without seeing or hearing anything else. The ambient track alone feels like an encapsulation of danger to me. Not going about this in a way that's over the top, as I felt was the case with FNAF 2, but instead presenting a feeling of unbridled dread, which I still find pretty sublime. As the track continues throughout the night as well, we do find it does actually evolve into something a bit different, removing the bassy notes for these higher pitched chimes that appear to be overlapping each other, with some even playing in reverse. And for me, this part of the track seems to simply be reinforcing where we found ourselves and who we're playing as. These chimes, which almost sound like something generated from a copmobile, reminds us that we're playing as a young child, hiding in our bedroom at night, completely by ourselves. A prospect that could be pretty scary for any young kid anyways, even without the killer animatronics. Alongside the ambience, we still have other pieces of audio that do even more to enhance the experience. Some, like the crickets for example, being persistent throughout the entire night, doing a great job in fleshing out the world and the more unconventional environment we found ourselves in compared to the previous games. But you obviously have others, like the clock that rings at the start of each night, working well and setting the tone for the night we're about to go through, as well as from a gameplay point, temporarily introducing even more outside noise that could get in the way of the vital footstep sounds that are created by the animatronics. And talking of them, I think most, not all, but most of the jump scares in this game are some of the best yet. Now to some players, the heavy emphasis on jump scares might have started wearing thin, and I do very much understand that. There's now an expectation when going into these games that blaring screams and shocking visuals are going to be thrown at us at one point or another. That's kind of why FNAF 3s were so underwhelming for the most part. That expectation was still met, but to a negligible degree. The noise which these guys generate is absurdly loud, which when taken into account the volume increase the game essentially requires you to take, results in by far the most startling jump scare in the series for me. The build-up's excellent, with not just the atmosphere contributing to that, but also the mechanic of illuminating the darkness in our hallways. Those ones are by far the scariest jump scares in the game, as although it might seem like you can brace yourself because of how you're in control of the light, you've also got the several instances that would have likely occurred before where you flash your light and there isn't a jump scare. You can almost be fooled at times when it comes to thinking you're in control, where lowering your guard could result in an even more frightening shock. All of their animations look great as well, presenting exactly what you'd expect from the previous game, with all these animatronics getting right up in your face and screaming. But there's something about the ones in this game that look particularly realistic, and I'm not quite sure why. All the models look great of course, but graphically, they're not a massive jump from anything else we've seen, so I have to assume it mainly stems from the two standout characteristics that define these jump scares for me, and that's the lighting and the movement. When comparing all the jump scares in the first 3 games to what we see here, you'll notice in that all those games, not only are all the animatronics shown very clearly because of the lighting in our room, but for the endurance of them, we remain stuck to the spot. We don't move whatsoever. In FNAF 4, from the way we move around, it's like the animatronics are actively picking us up, which fits into the idea of us being a small child. And when it comes to the lighting, having the flashlight work as our only form of light not only works well in terms of that fear of the unknown factor, but with the jump scares, as I find the lighting's handled in a genuinely realistic manner, I realise this may be the key reason as to why all these stand out to me so much. The way it illuminates their eyes, the shadows that are created behind them. You pair that up with the heavy amount of motion blur we see when getting shaken around, and I think Cawthon's managed to achieve a genuinely frightening visual which stands on its own. It looks scary, even without the blaring audio this time, or at least that's what I think. The only issue is that while the vast majority of them are great, I do still think there's a few which are somewhat lackluster, and I'd say this comes down to both the position of where the jump scare takes place, and the particular animatronic that's actually jump scaring us. The first is an issue I mostly have when in the main part of the bedroom, as when here, the way you get jump scared is when you have your back turned while looking at the bed, when looking in the wardrobe, or simply when you're in the center of your room. As you're able to see from the map, if you continue staring forward and refuse to look at the bed, you'll see that Bonnie and Chica will go on a cycle of approaching our doorway and backing off again. They're unable to enter your room from this position, but it's obviously not practical in any way, considering you end up dying to Freddy if you consistently do this. And I'm not just talking about when finally looking back to the bed, as although there is a variant of Freddy's jump scare that applies to the bed, refusing to look at the Freddles for a while will start resulting in your vision going dark. where after a while, Freddy will simply end up jump scaring you in the center of your room. And that's where my biggest issue lies, as I find all of these jump scares far more predictable compared to the ones in our doorways. As you saw with that Freddy one, our screen literally goes black for a second and then we get a jump scare. Once it goes dark, it's very obvious what's about to happen. But even when it comes to the animatronics that enter our room, there's yet another gap which is created that allows players to brace themselves. The jump scare doesn't happen immediately. You get the animation of us turning back round to the center of the room and then it happens. This is where the second issue can reveal itself, although it's not one I take too much issue with. And that's the fact that when it comes to Chica's cupcake, which replaces Chica for the bedroom jump scare, as well as Plush Trap, not only is the jump scare audio pitched up, which takes away from its impact quite significantly, but I find both characters simply nowhere near as intimidating, especially with the cupcake. The way it looks and the smaller size of it ends up making the jump scare more comical. With that being said, I would still say the audio and the jump scares overall in FNAF 4 are great. Much like I think can be seen in other elements, it appears to take a lot of influence from the first game in particular. The background audio is stark, unnerving, and really ground you in the scenario, and I'd say the jump scares reach a peak of sorts in this one, feeling mostly unexpected, appearing in a genuinely shocking manner, while featuring fantastic lighting and brilliant animatronic designs that bring a sense of realism to them as well. With there only being one more day before the party, we cut back to the crying child, and discover he's now been locked in what appears to be the backstage area of the restaurant. We don't learn anything particularly from this scene, simply seeing the crying child begging to be let out, before collapsing on the floor once again. It's a good time to say, however, that I think all these 8-bit scenes have once again been carried out really well. I think all the pixel art looks great, and although these play out in a more conventional manner with less secrets to find, they retain a level of creepiness that I primarily attribute to the soundtrack. There's two distinct audio tracks that play during these, one of which is heard during this penultimate scene as well as all the times we're in our house, and another which plays while in the main part of the restaurant and in the outside areas. The latter's more standard, mainly presenting sounds akin to an isolating wind or distant traffic, but the first one fits right into what we've been seeing throughout each and every sequence, whether it be from his brother or kids out on the street. The crying child, who seems to be plagued with a constant sense of fear, is mocked by those around him, and while the main part of this track purely encapsulates this feeling of isolation once again, the frequent laughter we hear throughout reinforces how the kid must be feeling. There's not one occasion we've seen where any form of comfort or safety is brought his way. His concerns and fears aren't taken seriously, and as a result, he's ridiculed and made to feel stupid. As I've said, Cawthon's touching on some heavy subjects: murders, bullying, family abuse, all of which revolve around young children, and I'd say it was a wise choice to handle all this stuff in the context of 8-bit sequences, because even though I'm relatively open to any of these subjects getting touched on, I imagine some may have found it slightly distasteful at points if carried out in a more realistic manner. Carrying it out in this way still conveys the plot, but there's inevitably a detachment that's also felt because of the unrealistic, old-school, gamey look it's shown in. And talking of the plot, there's a word I used a second ago that kind of sums up how I feel about FNAF 4's story, and that's conventional. Surprisingly, FNAF 4 doesn't feature the same degree of hidden messages, minigames, or secret screens as the previous ones, which might seem like a step back, especially when given my praise towards all these features before. However, as I feel is the case for much of FNAF 4 in its entirety, I find it's actually a breath of fresh air not having to constantly piece things together, or having vital discoveries be solely based on RNG. The vast majority of the stories conveyed solely through these 8-bit sequences. However, that's not to say there's nothing to be found in the main part of the game, because when it comes to one of these secret elements in particular, which once again is based on RNG, the whole game is put into a different context and makes more sense. It all comes down to what we witnessed during the final 8-bit sequence, being shown after the completion of Night 5. Night 5 itself actually alludes to the true final horror in which all this stems from, replacing all the other animatronics with simply one, and that animatronic is none other than Nightmare Fredbear. While he's relatively easy to deal with him walking back and forth between our two hallways and occasionally appearing in our wardrobe and bed, the guy's design is one of the best in the game. He features many unique elements that make him stand out from the rest. His golden colour, his purple hat and bow tie, even when looking to his teeth, we can see despite appearing like the same sharp metal ones we've seen with the others, you can actually see there's a noticeable red tinge at the base of them all, presumably being blood. His simplistic functionality doesn't stop him from being damn terrifying though, as unlike unlike most other animatronics who we only get a glimpse of from afar, with the exception of jump scares obviously, Fredbear works a bit differently when it comes to how he attacks. He'll run back and forth between both of our hallways, kind of like Foxy, but unlike the other animatronics, when he approaches closer to us, or referring back to the map, when he enters the second square, we can use our light like usual and see him. However, unlike Bonnie and Chica, this doesn't make him take a step back. I assume this was done due to how Fredbear never comes right up to your door, meaning there's no breathing to see if he's there or not. But once you see him, you gotta close your door straight away, and you'll start hearing him wander around once again. Your flashlight should be used carefully, however, as in the event he's standing in the initial square, flashing your light a couple times results in him coming even closer to your door, which you can still survive by closing it, but as you can see, it gives you an even more frightening visual. I think all the instances of seeing Fredbear in our hallway really puts the size of these animatronics into perspective. We only really see that from the others when they jump scare us, but as Fredbear can get so up close at times, we can really feel him towering over us. The image that's shown when he's right next to our door, for example, he takes up most of our screen. The evilest move he's able to pull though comes from when he enters your room. Every time you hear a laugh, there's a chance that you'll find his head either sitting on your bed or in your wardrobe. Both of these can be dealt with easily, either shining our light or closing the doors. But it's the laugh that's the biggest problem, because as you may have found in previous nights, and especially during this one, these same laughs are played as random ambient sounds. So you're left at points wondering if Fredbear's entered your room, when it may have ultimately been a random sound effect. And as a result, you could waste your time checking if he's in your room and get a game over. On the surface, it sounds unfair, and it kind of is. As there's no real indication outside the footsteps which inform you the laugh you're hearing does or doesn't apply to him, there are points where you'll basically have no idea. And on top of that, when he's set on going down one of your hallways, you're not going to hear any sound until you've closed the door and backed him off. I don't really have an issue though. It is a sneaky trick to pull, but the night on the whole was easy enough and unique enough to where I don't really have any issue trying again. I'm a big fan of the Fredbear night. It's a nice change of pace compared to the nights which came before it, presenting a brand new threat without any warning and telling the player to just get on with it basically. As I say, the way he works isn't too far off what we've already been grappling with, and aside from having a night I'd perceive as being quite a bit easier, which to be honest is somewhat of a relief considering how much more stressful some of the earlier nights can be. I love the idea of throwing a brand new animatronic into the mix right on the final night. Being kept on my toes and continually surprised is exactly what I search for in any game, not solely horror, and with the nightmarish atmosphere still working to its absolute best during night 5, laying eyes on this absolute beast only makes things even better. Getting back to that final 8-bit sequence though, we finally reached the crying child's birthday, which only means one thing: it's time for his party at Fredbear's family diner, and as expected, there's no happiness to see here. The kid's still crying on the floor, as he's now surrounded by 4 other people wearing masks. The one wearing the Foxy mask who's been scaring us at home is confirmed to be our brother, with him coming up with the great idea of picking the crying child up and bringing him right close to Fredbear, which all of his friends assist him in doing. As they bring him closer, we see him begin to panic more and more, begging to be put down, but this only encourages them even more, eventually stuffing the kid inside Fredbear's mouth, in which his head ends up getting crushed in the process. The first thing a lot of people's minds will gravitate towards is obviously the bite of 87, but we know this can't be it. We've already seen that we're actually in 1983. And while there is eventually some pretty vague allusions towards certain characters and the significance of this event, I can see why some people find FNAF 4 somewhat irrelevant in a story sense. I personally don't mind it, but I get many fans want everything to link together and have a deep amount of meaning, but especially before the elaboration we'd eventually see on these events quite a bit after the game's release. FNAF 4 very much appeared like more of a self-contained narrative. We know figures like the crying child aren't linked to the marionette because of the time period, and also the fact he isn't killed by Purple Guy. At most, you can now theorize that the reason we never see the spring suits again could possibly be because of the bite of 83, but again, that's fairly irrelevant. Did we really have to know why these old animatronics were phased out for the new ones? No, and that's why I can very much understand why people would describe FNAF 4's story as mostly padding. I have no real issue with that though. One, because the game wouldn't exist without it, and I think think there's some genuinely excellent things to appreciate on the gameplay front, and 2, because I actually enjoy what we see here. While playing, it might not feel like it's linked directly to anything that was set up in the previous games, but watching the story play out, it's the first time where I started appreciating what Cawthon's tackling thematically, compared to always observing the plot from a literal point of view. We see the loneliness and isolation felt by the crying child, the abuse he suffers at the hands of his own brother, with his mother and father appearing nowhere in sight. We see his fear towards the animatronics, but from the dolls we see in his room, as well as his imaginary golden friend, it's also understood that he's likely a fan of these characters, which is once again tainted and destroyed by his brother. And most of all, it's highlighting a cycle of violence that continues on year after year. Look at the imagery of this scene for a second. 4 kids standing in masks, looking at Fredbear clamping down on a crying child. There's most definitely a similarity between this and the Happiest Day minigame from FNAF 3, with the Happiest Day idea itself seeming to be related to a birthday party, from all the balloons and cake we see. Now we obviously know the crying child in that instance is related to the 5 kids who were killed, as well as the marionette. So once again, we're not saying the events of FNAF 4 are actually linked to this. The visual itself is everything, and the reversal of the image in FNAF 4's case completes the idea of continuous generational evil and violence that continues to permeate society. Or at least I think so. Watching these events play out though, there's one vital detail we're able to witness in the main part of the game that essentially confirms what we're experiencing the whole time. This is basically the sole RNG based secret in the game. There is other occasions where RNG is still a factor. For example, many of the ambient sounds we can hear are random, things like the dog barking, the demonic laughter, and also the sound of a pitched down and reversed version of Phone Guy during the first game. But everything else is out in the open. Much like every other game that came before it, you can honk Freddy's nose on the bed. And for those who didn't know, all of the framed pictures that we're able to see around our room and down the hallways are actually just family photos of Scott and his family. In terms of the RNG based secret though, occasionally when turning around to look at our bed, there's a 1 in 100 chance that 3 items will appear next to our bedside table, these being a vase with flowers in it, some pills, and an IV drip. And from all those items, you should be able to piece together what this part of the game is recontextualized as. Naming the animatronics in this game nightmares now seems to be a whole lot more literal than we first thought. While we're still taking control of the crying child, it seems that instead of witnessing events that are playing out in reality, we've been viewing the nightmares he's experiencing, while likely in some form of coma after the bite incident. All these items are things you could clearly imagine being placed in the context of a hospital. Flowers for condolences, an IV drip and pills to try and improve the state he's currently in. Make no mistake, although there's certain things we discover in the next game that throw a spanner into the works somewhat, the original intention is most definitely what I'm describing. We've been playing inside the mind of this kid, experiencing the hellish nightmares he's been enduring in a comatose state, and this is backed up even more in regards to what we see after completing night 6. The crying child appears in a black void, with only his toys and Fredbear coming along with him. Someone calls out to us, asking us if we can hear them, and that they're sorry, with the grey colour of the text indicating it's his brother talking, and apologising for what he and his friends did to him. One by one, the toys fade away, seeming to indicate the child's mind and body slowly shutting down, and despite being told by Fredbear that he'll put us back together, the child himself eventually fades away too. A surprisingly sad and well put together closing sequence, especially for a game that primarily works in extremes. But that's FNAF 4. Once again, we don't have any custom night, but instead are given the extra tab, allowing us to look at the animatronics, see how some of them were created, witness all their jump scares, and even play fun with Plush Trap whenever we want. To unlock the final 3 options that remain greyed out, however, we need to complete 2 additional nights, and that's night 7, which is listed as Nightmare on this menu, as well as night 8, which we can activate by typing 20 on our keyboard 4 times. As you could have guessed, these are some of the more difficult nights in the game, cranking the challenge up to the max, especially in the case of the 420 mode, with both of these following the same pattern which we saw from night 6, that being a night that's mostly focused on dealing with the usual 4 animatronics, before then having a character known as Nightmare show up from 4 AM onwards, behaving exactly the same as Fredbear, and in terms of appearance, simply being a version of Fredbear that appears black and transparent. After completing the Nightmare night, we're taken to a box with 2 padlocks on it, both of which we can move around. A message eventually appears, telling us perhaps some things are best left forgotten, for now. And this screen can mean as much or little as you want it to mean. Much like the suitcase from Pulp Fiction, we'll never truly know what's inside, and it's unclear if Cawthon himself even knows. I know some fans get annoyed by this stuff, preferring to work with absolutes, but I've got no problem with it really. It worked well in keeping a good amount of buzz and interest around the series. Fans were going crazy for a while trying to figure out what was inside, coming up with all kinds of wild theories. But if you want to talk realistically, there is literally nothing. There's no hidden file that shows us what's inside, and no way to break the padlocks. It's an effort from Cawthon to keep the player interested, even after they shut the game down. And I don't mean that from a cynical point of view, like he's putting these things in purely to generate more talk around his games. I see it as a technique used to almost prolong your enjoyment and appreciation of a piece of work. Look at a show like Twin Peaks, for example. The question everyone was asking during the first series was who killed Laura Palmer, a question that series creators Mark Frost and David Lynch never planned on actually answering. But when eventually being put into a position where they were essentially forced to, the mystery was dead. There was no longer a reason for viewers to keep coming back. The burning question had been answered. No matter if you were satisfied or unsatisfied, there was no longer that overarching plot point to push the series forward. And while in this case, the mystery is somewhat irrelevant, considering the box never gets brought up to any substantial degree again, it is still a mystery nonetheless, one that I imagine will never get answered, which will always mean someone discovering the game for the first time could come up with a brand new theory on what they think is inside the box. Anyways, after beating Nightmare, you unlock the cheats, which lets you activate things like a map of the house, with corresponding icons that tell you where each animatronic is. You're also able to speed up each night with the Fast Nights cheat, and can also turn on the danger indicator, which makes it more blatant when one of the animatronics is standing by your door. And upon completing the 420 mode, you unlock the final 2 tabs, in which I should also say that all 3 of these were actually added after the game's initial release with the Halloween update. This Halloween update didn't solely apply to the main game, however, because as you're able to see, when opening up FNAF 4, we're given the choice between the normal game and the Halloween edition. Now when it comes to the game's mechanics, the story sequences, and everything we see in the extra menu, all of that is almost identical between the 2 versions. The only difference would be the Halloween additions to the 8-bit moments, where in several of the environments, we can see many of the colours have been altered to feature ones like orange and black, as well as having jack-o'-lanterns, cobwebs, and bats applied to the scenery at points. The biggest difference comes from the animatronics during each night, having Bonnie and Chica replaced with an alternate bright orange version of each character, obviously resembling a jack-o'-lantern. You've also got Mangle replacing Foxy, Balloon Boy fully replacing Plushtrap, and the Marionette replacing Nightmare. All of these are just as frightening as their main game counterparts, with the highlight for me being the utterly bizarre looking Nightmarion. Certain images, like when it appears behind our bed, are really freaky, and the design itself, with its beaming white eyes and sharp jagged legs, looks particularly strange. When it comes to the challenges the update introduced though, I think much like what we saw in FNAF 2, all of these uniquely set options, which will actively disadvantage us, will not only hold the player's attention for a longer period of time, but it simultaneously can make us appreciate how the game's been designed, and what the key principles are when it comes to how the gameplay's been laid out. Take the blind mode for example, a mode that had you going through a night while seeing quite literally nothing. What sounds like an insane idea initially, quickly becomes a non-issue, because as you're made to realise while playing, so long as you know where each threat is positioned, which should ultimately be the case if you've managed to unlock the challenges to begin with, sound is all you really need to survive. And it's not just the sound that helps you, because that's too general, it's the way it's been implemented. You're not left wondering what the footsteps to your left indicate, as you would have picked up over time how the 3 different volume levels represent how close the animatronic is. That's what I see as the most interesting challenge here though. All the others are mainly based on just making the experience outright harder. Mad Freddy makes the Freddles more intense, Insta Foxy has Foxy starting your wardrobe right from the start of the night, and All Nightmare has you going up against solely Nightmare for a whole night. Much like our completion of nights 1 to 8, some additional stars can be attained on the main menu for the completion of both all 4 individual challenges, as well as certain combinations. For example, to get one of the stars, you have to complete a night while Blind Mode, Mad Freddy, and Insta Foxy are all simultaneously active. And what do all these stars get you? That's right, nothing at all. I don't mind it though, at least it provides an incentive. Not one I find as encouraging to pursue compared to FNAF 2's with the stars and figures we could acquire in our office, but an incentive nonetheless. To put it simply, FNAF 4 remains one of the only games in the series that can still genuinely scare me when coming back to it. Despite the paring back of gameplay systems, I find the experience to be constantly engaging and consistently frightening, perhaps even more so than some of the previous entries. I think from an artistic point of view, everything from the animatronics to the environments all look fantastic. I found the heavy focus on sound is superbly backed up by how layered and intricate the sound design is. And from a story point of view, we witness a a tried and tested tale of an outright tragedy. Nothing I'm going to be ranting and raving about for years to come, but still impactful at points regardless. I'd say that FNAF 4 still remains one of my favourite entries in the whole series. While there were genuine flaws I could point out in the previous two, FNAF 4 to me feels incredibly well crafted on all fronts. Every design choice feels like there's an intention behind it, and the gameplay changes do present genuine innovation on top of that. Before we reach the next mainline release, however, we end up getting what I perceive as the first spin-off in the series, FNAF World. Now, I say what I perceive to be a spin-off, because if we're going off technicalities, there's still some parts of the game that appear to be pushing the story forward, thus making it canon. But it's basically the exact same kind of thing we eventually see in the books. The entire experience is mostly taken with a grain of salt. However, when it comes to details that apply to the main story, those are then extrapolated and used to make certain elements of the plot make more sense. I'd say despite the usual hype Cawthon tried to build up for the game and the genuine qualities it features, FNAF World could potentially be the most forgotten title in the series. Upon its release, the game was met with quite a significant amount of criticism, not just in relation to the massive switch up in style and gameplay, as you would have already been seeing, but mainly because it felt rushed. You had things like the overworld, which appeared 2D, whereas the battles appeared in 3D, which was subsequently proven correct, with how Cawthon eventually updated the overworld sections to also be 3D. There were critiques over the battle system, and how during certain fights, almost the entire roster of characters we could choose from became useless, due to how they didn't have one particular move that would lead you to victory. You even had exploits in these earlier versions, which allowed you to beat the game in a few minutes or so. As a result, Cawthon pulled the game from Steam, released an apology, and to this day, the easiest way to play the game is by going onto GameJolt and downloading it from there. The game originally cost $10, and now an improved version was being given away for entirely free. Make no mistake though, this isn't purely a case of Cawthon trying to earn good guy points with the fans. We'll see later on when looking at other games he released for free, that Cawthon more than likely did this purely out of generosity, and even more likely, the regret he felt from charging people for the first iteration of the game. It is quite a shame to be honest, as when looking at FNAF World, even those early iterations definitely have a good amount of effort put into them, but looking at the most recent version we have today, I'll be honest, for someone who's not crazy on JRPGs, I had quite a lot of fun with this one. The style of the game is obviously completely different. Compared to the other FNAF games, it's been designed to look as kid-friendly as possible, whether it be the characters who bounce around, smiling and waving with absolute joy, the bright poppy colours we see during combat. This is not a horror game whatsoever, although there are some pretty creepy secrets still hidden throughout the game. Combat is the name of the game here, and from the way it's been designed, and even how the characters are laid out, you've got a full-on callback to some of Cawthon's previous games, like Legacy of Flan. I describe the experience as being most similar to a game like Pokemon. You've got a huge roster of characters to pick from, all of their cutesy designs looking great in my opinion. All of them have 3 moves they can choose from during a battle, with multiple of these animatronics having set purposes. Chica, for example, will be described as a healer, due to how all of her moves relate to healing your team. Then you've got more support-based ones that apply status effects to the enemy, and then you've got ones that attack the enemies directly. Some animatronics specialise in each of these individual roles, others feature more of a mix. Either way, the more you use them, the more they level up, and the more effective they become in combat. There are many you would describe to be objectively better compared to other ones though. No matter how high you level up Chica, for example, there's other healers in the game that are superior to her from level 1. The way we attain these guys is partly down to RNG, and also partly down to where you find yourself in the world. There's many different sections that make up FNAF World, all of which are relatively unimpressive visually, but they serve their purpose in being distinct from each other. More and more of these animatronics become available to collect the further we get into the game. So for example, while Shadow Freddy, Marionette, and Phantom Marionette can all be unlocked from Lilygear Lake onwards, they can't be unlocked anywhere prior to these areas. The way we get these characters seems to mostly be random from what I've experienced, although I did have a lot more success when deciding to run from battles. You'll be informed that a new challenge has appeared, and then have to beat up the new animatronic before they join your roster. I really enjoyed the idea of collecting all these animatronics. It was great to see many of the characters I've been previously familiar with in this massively different context, and on top of that, it was also fun to see what new attacks they held compared to the other characters I've been using, and checking to see if they were superior to what I already had. As for the combat itself, I'm not lying about the Flan comparison, it does feel very similar. Each character gets a chance to use one of their moves before going on to the next one of your animatronics. It's really as simple as that. Enemies attack whenever they want, you can run away during fights by holding down R, and you actually have 2 teams you can switch between at all times. So if the first team starts getting overwhelmed, you can switch over to the second team and finish the battle off more safely. Now, the deeper you get into the game, the more engaging I found the combat to be. As you could assume, each sequential area area gives us new and more difficult foes compared to the ones we were previously in, meaning that fights start going on longer, factors like your health become more important, and all the moves you make need to further your ultimate goal of getting the fight done as quickly as possible. If I'm being honest though, while I am someone who does actually enjoy the over-the-top visuals and ridiculous amount of flashing lights that are shown during the battles, there's not much I can really praise on a gameplay front. It is just very simplistic. I'm not witnessing anything that I haven't already seen before, and I'm also not seeing anything that's refined to a point of absolute excellence. You've also got to consider the flip side to what I just mentioned about the visuals. While I don't mind them, I can very much imagine some people hate the flashy visuals here, and I completely understand that. While I think they're somewhat charming, I have no issue with someone claiming they're ugly and annoying. The best thing I can really pick out in the combat system are many of the sound effects we hear when dealing damage to an enemy. That's honestly about it. I'm not trying to be harsh for the sake of it, but you've got to understand that Cawthon's now making a game in a completely different genre, one that's been around far longer than what he spawned with the FNAF games, and one that features games with much more depth in essentially all facets. On its own, FNAF World feels like a very average RPG, and nothing more. Much like all of his previous work, I can appreciate all the different character models we witness, the unique background environments, the overworld music, which did actually end up getting stuck in my head for a while, but I feel like this praise stems more from the surroundings of the game and the fact I know it's being made by one guy. Looking at the game purely on its own merits, there's nothing I'm truly thrilled about. While I enjoy the colourful nature of it, the graphics are nothing to really write home about. Simplistic gameplay, overwhelming effects, all on top of being a game related to the FNAF series that's nothing like a FNAF game whatsoever. The most FNAF thing about it mainly comes from the secrets we're able to find, and I will admit, they are quite cool. Take the discovery of the character Old Man Consequences for example, someone who we meet after going deeper and deeper into a glitch world, before arriving in this ominous red forest. Then you've got things like the guy we find in one of the buildings. His dialogue makes us realise very quickly that this is basically Cawthon inserting himself into the game, which ends up with FNAF World developing a surprisingly personal insight into how Cawthon may have felt at certain points in his career. This continues upon accessing the Halloween content from Update 2, where Cawthon makes the Fredbear character admit how much of a failure the game was, and that he doesn't understand why we're still playing. It's hilarious, but also pretty sad from Cawthon's perspective. I don't doubt, like many of his games prior to FNAF, he was hopeful that what he was creating was good, and that people would find it an enjoyable and worthwhile experience. And it's almost like what we're now seeing is him acknowledging that and making the best out of a bad situation. And that applies to the entirety of the second update's content, where Cawthon goes off the rails in a massive way. Constant fourth wall breaks, ridiculous gameplay scenarios, parodies of other indie horror games, as well as online rage games. There's even what seems to be an outright admission of what fans were claiming at the time in regards to Cawthon milking the franchise by having us play the game FNAF 57, Freddy in Space. That's what I mean about FNAF World having this strangely personal element to it. It seems like he doesn't particularly care how this game's perceived anymore, so appears to be filling it with literally whatever he wants. One of the multiple endings in this game has us returning to this visualization of Cawthon and having him say to us that he didn't want to disappoint people. It ends off with a teaser for the upcoming FNAF game that we'll get onto in a second, but as I say, when you start diving deeper into FNAF World and discovering more of these different endings and secrets, it does become a bit more interesting than its surface would imply.
The show will begin momentarily. Everyone, please stay in your seats.